Well, we want to welcome everybody to a fresh edition, the October edition of Archaeology of Connecticut. And to start things off, here's our state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman. Sarah, how are you?
Hi, Dave. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our October show of the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Sarah Sportman, Connecticut State Archaeologist, and I'm here with my co-host, the President of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeologist, Scott Brady.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Good. How are you guys doing? Welcome to the show. It's going to be always fun. Nick's going to, I'm sure, have great stories for us.
Yeah, and I also like to welcome our special guest, Emeritus State Archaeologist Bellantoni. He's been on the show a number of times before, and there's absolutely no one more qualified to talk about spooky archaeology in Connecticut. So tonight, to get into this...
Hey, thanks for having me back, guys.
Anytime. So tonight, to get into the spirit of Halloween, we're going to talk about, we're going to start off with a discussion about New England vampire lore and the archaeological evidence for vampire beliefs in Connecticut. And then for the second half of the show, we're going to switch gears a little, and Nick is going to talk about some of the tombs that he's investigated during his tenure as state archaeologist. And these investigations are featured in his new book called And So the Tomb Remains, Exploring Archaeology and Forensic Science Within Connecticut's Historical Family Mausolea, which will come out this December. So we're really excited for this show tonight. And I'm not sure that Nick really needs an introduction. He's been on the show so many times and everybody knows him. But you want to just remind everybody of who you are?
Sure. I served in Sarah's position as a state archaeologist for about 27 years, retiring about 6 years ago. And so now I get to write books and tell stories of all my adventures.
So to start off, Nick, I'm not sure how familiar our listeners might be with the history of vampire beliefs in southern New England in the 18th and 19th centuries. Can you talk a little bit about that before we get into the archaeology?
Sure. Well, this fall marks the 30th anniversary of our discovery of a burial that was rearranged because we believe, or the hypothesis is, that they believed the individual was undead in their graves and capable of leaving the housing of their grave and feeding on living family members and hence spreading diseases. And the basic disease at that time, this is in the early 19th century, would have been tuberculosis, which was absolutely epidemic in New England with no known source, no knowledge of germ theory. So how this all began 30 years ago is in Griswold, Connecticut, right near the Quinebaug River. There was a sand and gravel operation going on. And, it happened like this. They stopped work on a Friday, trucking out materials, sand and gravel for construction purposes. Stopped work on a Friday. Saturday, there was kind of a light rain in the atmosphere. And then on Sunday, 3 10-year-old boys came to the gravel pit to play. They were sliding down the slope, having a good old time. Well, one jump and slide down the slope dislodged a human skull that tumbled down the hill with the boys. And as you can imagine, they freaked right out. And one boy went running home to his mother, his parents, and he said, Ma, there's a skull in the gravel pit. And she didn't believe him. You've been watching too much television or what have you. But he went back to the gravel bank, picked up the skull, and he brought it home, to which his mother really climbed the wall. But she did the important thing. What she did was she called the police immediately. And the police came down and roped off the gravel bank as a potential crime scene. At that time, there was a serial killer by the name of Michael Ross who had been apprehended, and not all of his victims had been found. So the prevailing thought among the police were that maybe this was a victim of Michael Ross's dealings. The medical examiner in Farmington recognized that the bone was not fresh, was not of a modern criminal investigation, but in fact was old. There was cortical loss and flaking, and understood that the remains were historical and not part of a modern criminal investigation. And that's when they contacted myself as the state archaeologist. So I ran down to the gravel bank to investigate, and what I saw were six, up on the cliff, on the top of the cliff, I saw 6 dark soil stains, one next to each other, kind of coming off the cliff. And I recognized right away that those were burial shafts and that they had encountered the first row of a colonial graveyard that nobody knew was up there. There were no tombstones other than possible unmarked field stones that were not recognized. And as a result, they had no knowledge that they were mining into a colonial graveyard. So as a result, we recognized that because the sand and gravel was underway, the only way to preserve and protect these burials were to archaeologically remove them, excavate them, hopefully in a professional and respectful way, and do the analysis to try to determine who they are and rebury them in another colonial era cemetery so that they would be removed and safe. And that's how we got started in the project that would lead us to the discovery of a vampire.
What
you want me to keep telling the story, or
do you want to? You can. I mean, you can just keep going with your thread, or I can.
Okay. All right. So here's what happened next. We started to those excavations, and it was a very difficult excavation, by the way, because the sand and gravel cliff was very fragile, and the weight of us as archaeologists on those banks were contributing to the erosion. So we had to work in a way that was able to remove the remains and do so without losing any more collapse down the bank. Also, while we were doing the rescue operation, I sent researchers into the town hall, and I had them review land deeds because I wanted to know who these people might be or who owned this land back then. And they found a land deed that dated to 1775 for this parcel. And it said in the land deed that a Nathaniel Walton purchased the land for the purposes of burying his family. He purchased the land from a sea captain by the name of Samuel Johnson, who owned the surrounding land, and bought a plot at the top of this hill to bury his family. So it was kind of neat because now we had a family name, and one of my responsibilities was, once we knew this, is to try to find descendants. And working with genealogical societies, we started a search for Walton family members, from Griswold themselves, from the town of Griswold. When I started the excavations, I looked up on that gravel bank, and I mentioned I saw the darkened stains that the archaeologists recognize as features, disturbances in the soil, and those disturbances were caused by the digging of a grave, going through horizontal profiles of soil, putting a coffin down, and then refilling the grave shaft, and thus mix and modeling all of the layers and colorations of the soil. So in recognizing that, that's how I recognized the first row. However, what I also saw out of one of these features were bricks. Coming toward at the bottom of the feature stain, there was these unmortared bricks that were sticking out, and I really wasn't quite sure what that meant. So when we excavated horizontally down onto the burial, what we found was a crypt. So what they had done is they laid the individual in his coffin down. They built a single row of bricks around it, actually 7 high, and then covered that with good Eastern Connecticut flat field stones, and thus enclosed the crypt. So being in charge of the investigation, I opened the crypt. And when I did, I was able to look down on what was preserved of a black coffin lid. The coffin lid had been painted black. And on the lid, they had taken brass tacks and hammered the initials of the person laying there. And the initials for that person were NB. Now, I wasn't too thrilled because those are my initials. So I'm looking down on the coffin, and it's got my initials on it, and I'm not a happy camper. Underneath my initials, in brass tacks array, was the number 13. So I wasn't too thrilled about that either. But I remember saying to the crew, I said, look, we've got a problem. We're supposed to be, based on the land deed, in the Walton Cemetery. And we've got an individual here with a B surname. And so we started to do some genealogical work at that time into the Waltons to see if we could relate a B family. And sure enough, one of my students came in who had been helping us on it and came into my office one day and just smiling and brimming and said, I got him. I said, who do you have? He says, I found a Nathaniel Bennett, N.B., marries into the Walton family in 1794. I said, well, that's good. I said, can you associate the number 13 also with this Nathaniel Bennett? And he said, I got that too. It turns out he died on October 13th. Now, I wasn't too thrilled because that's my birthday. So here I am excavating a burial with my initials on it, and the individual died on my birthday. Turns out, however, it's not Nathaniel Bennett because based on the family genealogy, Nathaniel Bennett married into the Walton family and had 6 kids. Forensically, when we examined the skeleton, the individual laying there was 13 years old. So it was the NB was the name, was the initials, and 13 represented the age of death. 2 burials in the same row from him was another crypt. This one was made out of stone, so it was stone arched, stone on the side with some bricks to support it, and a stone arch over it. When I excavated that and opened up and removed the stones of the foot region of the coffin, the shins, if you will, the tibia and the feet were in perfect anatomical position. But then as I moved up the body, if you will, removing the top stones, I saw an individual that had been completely rearranged. And what I mean by that is that the femurs or thigh bones had been uprooted from their anatomical position between the hip and the knee and crossed over the chest. The chest had been broken into, and the skull or cranium had been deliberately decapitated and turned to rotated to face the west. And I was just totally befuddled by this. What was this? In fact, if you read our notes, our field notes, we reference to the Jolly Roger, where like a crossbone and skull, except that the skull was moved away from the chest area. As I mentioned, the chest had been broken into, and we could see by the damage on the bones. The other thing we were able to recognize pretty readily was that the fractures on the bone that occurred at this time occurred 5 or so years after this individual died. We could tell that because there's a difference with fresh bone or recently dead bone. If that were fractured or bone that has already started to decompose and fracture, the signatures are different. So we estimate that there was about a 5-year difference. So here's what happened. This particular burial, and by the way, this burial had brass tacks on the coffin lid, which was painted red of JB 55. And it turns out he's an adult male, 55 years of age. Okay? So JB dies and is buried. 5 years later, somebody comes to his grave, digs into him, rearranges his skeleton, closes it back up, and is not rediscovered until 1990 with our investigation of the sand and gravel operation. So my thoughts are like, what's going on? I had never seen this in a skeleton before or since. And I was quite befuddled. My first hypothesis, by the way, was vandalism. Maybe they dug into the burial to collect jewelry or memorabilia of some sort. However, that did not appear to be an accurate hypothesis because in all of the other graves there was nothing of material culture. The only thing we found were shroud pins that held a sheet together. These were hard-working, lower to middle-class farmers. They did not bury their dead with even clothing. They would have passed that on to the next generation. So it didn't seem like this one particular burial would have anything of value when the others didn't. Now, those of your listeners who have been listening to this program for a long time understand you can never use negative evidence in archaeology. If it's not there, you can't invent that it was there and take it. It's not there, it's not there. However, again, none of the other burials had anything that would be of value. And you don't have to rearrange the skeleton in this way if you're going to steal a ring or something like that. So I was not satisfied with this hypothesis. And that's when one of our researchers came to me, knowing that what we were dealing with here, and said to me, "Have you ever heard the story of the Jewett City vampire?" And, of course, I hadn't at that time. And I said, "Please do tell." And here's the story of what happened in Jewett. Now, Jewett City is an industrial town. Those of you in eastern Connecticut will know it is a part of Griswold, and actually about 2 miles or more from the Walton Cemetery, so not very far away. But what happened in Jewett City is that a family by the name of Ray was being adversely affected by consumption, which we call today tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was called consumption because the tubercular victims were felt to be wasting away. That is to say, they ate, but they got thinner and thinner. Their complexion got paler. There was a progressive sickness. If you read the early accounts in the literature, they talk about like somebody sucking the life out of these people. So what was happening in the Ray family is that one of the sons, a 24-year-old son, Lemuel, dies of tuberculosis in 1845. 4 years later, the father, Henry Ray, he dies of tuberculosis. 2 years later, a second son has come down with the disease and has died by 1851. And then by 1854, a third son, the eldest son, also named Henry after the father, is stricken with the disease. The family's desperate. The doctors couldn't help them. The churches couldn't help them. They can't understand how the disease is spreading through their family. And one thought that came to them was from what we believe were sometimes called quack doctors. These were doctors, some of these doctors were coming from Eastern Europe and Germany to America, and they were advising families like this that were losing members to tuberculosis that the spread of disease was coming from family members who had died of the disease but remained undead in their graves and were capable of leaving the housing of those graves and feed on the brothers and the father and hence spread the disease and kill them. And the doctors were advising them to go into the graves to find out which one of your ancestors is mischievous and, I guess, make them dead instead of undead. So in the Ray family in 1854,
hey, will you guys pass the popcorn,
and a
please?
number of townspeople go to the Jewett City Cemetery, which you could visit today, and the tombstones are still there. They dig into the two brothers and the father, see which one might still be undead. And what they determined that was whether there was still blood in the heart. Now, the heart would decompose, but if there may be some cakey stain still left. The blood isn't going to be liquid anymore, but it's going to be a cakey stain if it has survived. And that was interpreted as meaning the individual was still undead, was still alive in their grave. And the last son who died in 1851 still had this cakiness. So they went into his chest cavity. They broke into his chest cavity. They burned the heart in the grave and burned as much as they could of it, and then closed up the grave and left them there. The idea here is they did not understand germ theory. They did not understand the transmission of these diseases like tuberculosis. And so as a result, you had tubercular victims in a family with large farming families sitting at the dinner table and coughing and coughing. And nobody's covering their mouth. They're not wearing a mask like we do today. They're not keeping social distances. They're coughing, and they're spreading the disease within the family. Those same tubercular victims were sleeping in crowded bedrooms with maybe 4 or 5 other brothers and sisters, coughing all night and spreading the disease. So it was rampant. It was epidemic, especially within families. And when the doctors had no answer, when the churches had no answer, maybe, just maybe, this was the answer. And they were willing to go into the graves to find out if their ancestor remained undead. And so we started to develop this hypothesis. Could this JB55 have been rearranged in his grave because they thought he was a vampire? So, what we do in archaeology, because none of us were there in the early 19th century, even though some of my students think I go back that far, we develop what we call test implications. If the hypothesis is correct, what should we see? Fortunately, we were very lucky in that I very soon after learned about the New England vampire folk belief, was able to connect with a folklorist in Rhode Island by the name of Michael Bell. And some of you may know Michael. He wrote a book called Food for the Dead, which on the trail of the New England vampire, Wesleyan University Press. If you're interested in it, in this topic, this is the best book out there on the vampire folk belief. And his research came up with a number of, items that we could test. So, for example, Michael found in his research that the historical accounts of the vampire folk belief basically extended, from 1790s to the 1890s. Now, he has a couple of cases earlier and later, but it's basically for that 100 years in the 19th century. Also, he found that every case he could find, now these, when I say cases, he's looking at diaries, he's interviewing families, he's looking at town records, church records, he's looking at newspaper accounts. In all of these accounts, it's always a rural farming family involved. Not one of these accounts has ever been documented in an urban setting. And then he found that this was predominantly an activity that was going on in western Rhode Island and eastern Connecticut, along with parts of other parts of New England, like Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts. And in every single case that Michael was able to find, the vampire dies and is suspected of spreading tuberculosis. And he found that the remedy was, in many cases, the removal of the heart and the burning of the heart, if it was there, and also the rearrangement of the skeleton in the grave. So based on that, we developed a series of test implications. It should date between 1790 and 1890. It should be a rural farming family. Eastern Connecticut is a hot spot, and tuberculosis is what is the vampire is spreading. And there should be some kind of a remedy taken part in the grave to put the vampire to rest. So when we did the forensic work on JB, we found certainly that he was a very robust adult male. This guy was 6 foot tall, and in the early 19th century, that's a pretty good height. And we also found that he had a broken and healed fractures on his left side, his rib, his collarbone, and part of his knee. So it must have been maybe he suffered a fall, but fell off a horse, a wagon, who knows? But when he did heal. He lived through it. But then the major thing we found forensically was that he suffered from tuberculosis, and we know that because we have found tubercular lesions on his left ribs. It's a grayish-white stain on the bone, and it is a very typical signature of pulmonary tuberculosis. So we were able to confidently say that JB had tuberculosis. So when we look at the hypothesis, and the support of the hypothesis is that, first of all, the burial is rearranged consistent with the folk belief methods that Michael Bell found in the accounts. It's in a cemetery in eastern Connecticut, a hot spot, and it's a rural farming family cemetery. In fact, it's only 2 miles from Jewett City and a reported vampire event. Dating the coffin that JB, and also NB, by the way, were in, that style of coffin we start seeing in the archaeological record around the early 19th century. That style coffin will date usually anywhere between 1790 and 1830. This is based on the configuration. There was a two-piece lid, the brass tacks, and everything that we saw. So we date those burials based on the coffin hardware, and style to the early 19th century, which is exactly when this was the vampire folk belief was at its best. But the real kicker of it all was the fact that we can say that JB had tuberculosis, which again is consistent with the other cases. So, could there have been another reason why they went into the grave 5 years later and rearranged JB, other than they felt he was undead in his grave and spreading diseases to his family? Sure. However, the best we can do is develop the high test implications, test those through the hypothesis, and I can honestly say that none of the tests, if you will, proved negative. In every case, they supported what we know of the vampire folk belief. So, one more mystery, guys, and that is the B family. Remember, we knew of the Waltons. It turns out the Waltons lived in Griswold up until around 1803 or so. They moved in 1803 to the west. They moved out to northeast Ohio, where that area was opening up as the Western Reserve. And a lot of people, farmers from Connecticut, went out there to farm that flatter, less stony soil. The Waltons were one of them. The B family then comes in the 19th century and starts to use the cemetery. We searched land deeds. We searched records. We could not find anything positive on the B family. One of the problems was there were so many B candidates. There was Bishops, Bennetts, Browns, Bissells, Burtons, Barbers, no Bellantonis, by the way. We didn't come over until the 20th century, but we had a number of candidates, and we could not zone in on the B family. And we had a number of researchers that went in to try to find this. And one of them was Roger Thompson, a former president of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, Scott's position right now. But we couldn't solve it. We did DNA about 10 years ago, and even that did not help us. However, last year, based on new DNA techniques, our colleagues down at the Armed Forces Medical Examiners Systems Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory in Washington, D.C., reran new tests on JB, and the results came out and showed great comparisons. They compared it with the family tree DNA project, and in two cases, they did two cases. In both cases, they were able to link the surname Barber to JB. And that was pretty compelling. But where in the historic records could we find this? One of our colleagues, Katie Gagnon, who worked with us recently on this, went to the Charles Hale Index. And those of you that know, this is a cemetery index for the state of Connecticut at the State Library, and it has inscriptions and newspaper accounts. And what Katie found in the Hale Index, that there was a John Barber, J.B., whose son, Nathan Barber, N.B., died at 12 years of age in 1826. Now remember, N.B. had a 13, not a 12, and you could say, well, that's pretty close. But it actually is the same, because the way they calculated dates with the Latin AE, age of, was not based on birthdays, but based on the years that you lived. So NB would have been 12 years old, not 13 years old. He would have been in his 12th year, or actually would have been in his 13th year. Excuse me. He would have been in his 13th year, but not yet 13. Okay, so I'm 71, even though I don't like to spread it. But until I have my 72nd birthday, I've been around for 72 years. Okay? So that's how they calculated it. So this is really fascinating. We have no other references historically to John Barber and Nathan Barber. But the two links now have really closed us up on who this individual family may be, and that research is continuing. So it's 30 years now, and even last year we were uncovering new evidences. So that's what's great about archaeology and science. It's open-ended. There's more work to do, even on puzzles like this, and hopefully before long we'll hopefully solve this whole mystery of the vampire. And the vampire folk belief in New England.
That's amazing.
Wow.
Phew, guys, that's a long story.
That is amazing.
We didn't even have to talk.
Yeah.
Man. So any questions you guys have about this? Because it's, it's a fascinating tale. It's part of our history we don't talk much about or understand much about. But again, those of you that are interested in this, I would go to Michael Bell, Food for the Dead, Wesleyan University Press.
Why do you think that these beliefs were prominent in farming families and they didn't seem to reach into urban areas? Do you have a theory about that?
Yeah, so far the only urban case we found was, and Michael Bell's research is ongoing, so I don't want to speak for him because he may have found something since I last spoke with him, but was in Chicago, Illinois. Now, that's a little farther west than New England. However, it turns out that the individual was a displaced New Englander who dug into the grave of his father. And, guys, I also, lessons to be learned of for today with our COVID pandemic, similarities. Not similarities in the sense that we're going to prevent COVID by going into the graves of our dead loved ones. But the fact is, when we cannot deal with a pandemic, tuberculosis in the 19th century, smallpox in the 18th century, COVID in the 21st century, people will do, we'll do hopefully what all the doctors tell us to do: wear masks, keep social distances, avoid crowds, do what we can. But if that doesn't work, and we're losing loved ones, are getting sick and dying, and some people are going to do irrational behaviors. Drink the Clorox, I don't know. They're going to do irrational behaviors just to see if it works, because they're doing it out of fear and love. And that's what was going on. This was not Bela Lugosi. This is not Dracula flying through the air as bats. We don't know how they transmitted. But this was a public health issue in the 19th century, before they understood germ theory, before they had the science behind them. And as a result, this was one way of responding to it. And we're not above that. We will do irrational behaviors, too, if we think it's going to help save us. And so there's lessons for today also, I'd like to think.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine how traumatizing it would be to dig into your relative's grave. I mean, you must really, really, really be worried.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a certain
These families were
desperation in
extremely
that, isn't
stressed.
there? Nick, you were talking about the one of the, I think it was NB's grave shaft had a brick lining, almost like a brick crypt that was built in there. Have you seen that in other graves? That seems a little unusual to me.
Yeah, actually, this was the first time I'd ever seen a brick-lined crypt. I had seen stone crypts before, like the one JB had. That I recognized immediately. When I first saw those bricks, I thought, well, maybe they housed the tombstone or something, as a base. But then we saw but I have since then, in other cases, have seen brick-lined crypts, notably in cemetery in New London, and one in Danbury, if I'm not mistaken. But I have seen them subsequently. But that was the Walton Cemetery was the first time I'd ever seen one. So I didn't realize that they were using that. Now, why they were crypts, I don't know. We found members of the family, females, women and girls who did not get crypts. But it seems like the father and the son both got crypts. So it could be a social status thing. It also could be something coming with advances in funerary process into the 19th century, where instead of just being put in the ground, you were like today, we put you in a vault. The crypt served as a vault to keep the soil off of the coffin. But I don't believe, and people have asked this, that the crypt was used to enclose the vampire. Because when JB died, he was not considered a vampire. It was only later that he was considered a vampire.
It's another little, one of those little facets of mortuary and burial practices that changes over time and becomes a way to help identify the time periods of some of these burials.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Like any other technology, the technology of coffins and caskets changed through time, especially when you get into the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution now. And actually, that's when you start seeing kind of professional undertakers, funeral directors later on. So, before that, in the 18th century, the 17th century, a local carpenter banged out a box. But by the 19th century, we could offer a different, lid that could lift up, two pieces. We see sometimes windows, a glass, so not a window, a window, a glass on the lid, so you could look in on the face without having, during the funeral process, without having to lift the hood. You see nameplates, and in this case, brass tacks, and you see also changes in the nails. As you go through time, the changes in the hardware are very helpful to archaeologists in dating these burials that are unmarked.
Well, I think we should have put out a notice to our listeners to make sure that they had popcorn and treats for another episode with the best storyteller we know. That's just amazing stuff, Nick.
We don't lack the stories, Dave.
Well,
do we want to?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Dave.
I was just going to ask Sarah. Nick, did this journey have anything to do with your motivation to get into a book that dealt with where people were buried and uncovering some of their stories?
Well, the book is specifically burials in tombs, basically starting about the American Revolution. Some very wealthy families in Connecticut were now starting to bury their dead, not just simply in the ground with the burden of the soil over them, but kind of chambers that they dug into the side of hills, lined with stone and bricks, and then buried their dead within these vaults, if you will. And so it turns out, part of my claims to fame, my infamousy, if you will, is that I've probably been in more tombs than anyone in New England and probably the United States. And what I've done in the new book is highlight 6 of my tomb projects and talk about the archaeology, the forensic work on the skeletons, the history of the families, and try to tell it in a storytelling fashion, but allow for the science to help us conclude on who some of these people were. Even though we knew the families, in many cases we had no records as to which family members were buried inside these tombs. So using the genealogical record, the family histories, as well as the forensics of the biology of the skeletons themselves, trying to zone in on and name certain individuals that were in the tombs, and we were relatively successful on that. 2 of the projects turned out to be police investigations because in 2 of these tomb projects, vandals had broken into tombs to collect skeletal remains, skulls, and other bones for satanic cult and Santeria rituals of healing and harming. And so that involved, those stories involved police investigations and trying to determine what skeletal elements were removed that were needed in these rituals and how we contributed toward the investigation. So the tombs are particularly interesting. And what I found interesting about them is comparing the health. These were these tombs were the upper class, the socioeconomic political class of Connecticut's history, and comparing their health with, say, families like the Waltons, who were, as I mentioned, low-income farmers. It was very interesting to see the differences or the similarities in health, tuberculosis, traumas, and so forth. And what we found overall is that these families still suffered the same degree of trauma, the same degree of arthritic issues, the same degree of problems, if you will, health problems that the lower economic folks in New England at that time were suffering from. The only difference is we found evidence of medical care, doctors and dentists on these socioeconomically upper-class folks. So really interesting stuff in terms of the implications are far beyond identity, but also helping us understand health patterns in the past.
So apart from the police investigations, how did you get involved in these tomb projects? What were the other projects?
The other tomb projects were mostly reconstructions, restoration projects. Basically, many of these, like as I mentioned, were built in the 1790s, 1780s, and unmortared unmortared stone, granite, and now by the late 20th century, they were starting to collapse. And so with the restoration projects, we were asked in some cases by the families to go in and try to identify. One restoration project, some of your listeners may remember, was the tomb of Samuel Huntington, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a 10-term governor of the state of Connecticut. His tomb was collapsing in Norwich Town Cemetery, and the Norwich Historical Society raised funds to have the tomb restored. In that process, we had to remove the remains of Samuel Huntington, one of our founding fathers, and his wife, Martha, so that the restoration could go on. And then afterward, they were put in new coffins and reburied with full military honors. of a former governor and founding father. That's a great story, and that's in the book too. So some of these had to do with restoration projects that required our assistance, and others were police vandalisms that we were called in on.
Okay, so because this is a Halloween show, because we're talking about dead and these things, did you ever encounter any kind of scary situations in these, or was it all very straightforward and scientific? Was there anything that ever freaked you out? Besides I guess the NB was a good example of that. Was there anything in the two?
We try to maintain a scientific perspective. However, I'm going to tell you one story. And this is a true story, by the way. We were called in to work on the Mosley family tomb, and that needed restoration by the East Haddam Historical Society. And in discussions with the Mosley family, who now live in California here, they asked if we would go in to see if we could identify the skeleton of a particular ancestor named Jonathan Ogden Mosley. Jonathan Ogden Mosley was a congressman at-large district from East Haddam and served in like 7 consecutive Congresses, United States Congresses. When he left Congress, he moved out to Saginaw, Michigan, where his son had gone, and he ended up dying there at the age of 80. And there's no record. He's the only congressman, but the Library of Congress has no burial record for it. As a result, they didn't know if he was buried in Saginaw or his body had been brought back to the family tomb in East Haddam. And so the family asked if we would go in and see if we could forensically identify the congressman. So the tomb is stone. It's got a metal door that was really rusted, and we pried it as wide as we could. I got my body in sideways and went into the darkened tomb. I couldn't see much, called for a light. I put the light on my shoulder, and there was a mass of skeletons all over, all disarticulated. They had stacked wooden coffins, and the coffins collapsed with time and desiccation. And so as a result, there were bones everywhere. But I saw this one skull that was looking at me, and I could see, even from a distance, that it was that of an older adult male of European ancestry. And said, this could be my congressman. So I very carefully go back into the tomb, and I bend down to pick up this skull, and my hands are not 2 inches from it when it starts to rock. It starts to move. The skull is swaying as if my hand had some kind of energy, and I'm saying to myself, I've never seen that before. And just as I said it, a mouse shot out of the skull. The mice had made a bedding of the empty skull, cranial vault, and the mouse shoots out of it, and of course in a very professional and scientific way I said, "No!" And everybody couldn't understand why I was screaming. They were so concerned for me. I came out of the tomb and explained about the mouse, and for some reason they all started to laugh. I don't understand it. I didn't see the humor in it at all, but the mouse scared me to dickens. But that's probably the one story where I was ever really frightened in a tomb.
That's a pretty good one.
Tell them what the crew gave you the next day at lunch.
True story.
What's that?
Dick, tell them what the crew gave you at lunch the next day after your mouse incident.
Sarah, could you repeat that? I can't hear Scott very well.
Scott said, tell him what the crew gave you the next day at lunch after the match.
So the crew was made up of students at UConn and members of the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. And the next day at lunch, they presented me with a little box with, wrapping and a bow and so forth at lunch. And they wanted me to have it, and I felt very honored. And I opened it up, and it was 2 mouse traps. And they basically said, you may need this in your future tomb investigations.
Nick, your book is going to be available starting early December?
Yeah, it's going to be available starting December 14th. It should be available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all of them. It's published by Oxbow Books for Oxford University Press.
So can I ask a related question? It is you're this threesome is the best group of specialists and smart people that I can possibly bounce this off of. But lately, we've been spending a lot of time, because it is the month of Halloween, and it's a high topic, and we have programs about myths and legends, and we love going on these journeys. But Alice Apsley has been somebody that we've been talking about a lot, and she is also better known as Lady Fenwick, and she was exhumed during the Valley Railroad's 1850s, putting in the rail line down at Saybrook Point, and we had Michael McBride in today, and part of the permanent collection at the Henry Whitfield State Museum is and it's framed, is a part of her, one of her locks, and I think the Old Saybrook Historical Society has a similar one. Have these pieces been authenticated to the best of your knowledge? Is it possible for hair to survive that long?
Yeah, a lot of that depends on the composition of the soil. Okay, so the more acidic the soil is, the faster a skeletal remains, and certainly soft tissue will start to deteriorate. It's very, very unusual for hair to last that long. Is it possible under the right microenvironmental conditions? The answer may be yes, but that's a long time for hair to preserve in the soil. They may have been looking at something else. It's hard to tell because of how it was done and when it was done. That's when we wish we had archaeologists back then, so that could help, with the proper excavation and interpretation. But very unlikely, but I won't say totally impossible.
So, Dave, was this hair that was supposed to have been collected before she died, though, or is it after?
No. When they exhumed her, they kind of took whatever they could find to I guess honor her memory and have a nice little knickknack, and so there are those that have a couple of samples of her hair, and it's just something that I've always wondered. Oftentimes the story is much better than the reality, and didn't know how much truth there could be in this.
Yeah, sometimes, like in one of Nick's cases with Alfred Predahawk, if there's certain metals will leach minerals, brass in particular, and can help preserve organic material. So that will sometimes help preserve it for longer than it would naturally preserve in an organic soil like we have here in Connecticut. But again, usually that turns everything green, so it would be very obvious.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yep. Good stories, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, as always. You do have the best stories.
Yes, Nick deserves special credit. This is the longest caller we've had. He's out, I believe, in California visiting grandkids.
Oh, no.
Giving up his time to come on and talk to us, so we're very appreciative of that.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thanks for having us, guys. I miss you guys, so hopefully we can get together soon.
Well, before we sign off, can everybody just quickly go around and let people know how they can find, follow, and be part of things? Scott, you want to talk about FOSA just for a second?
Sure. FOSA is the Friends Group. We support the Office of State Archaeology. We have a Facebook page, FOSA Connecticut, and we also have a website, FOSA-CT.org. That's FOSA-CT.org. And you can get all the information you need about us there.
And Nick, how can people? Are you on social platforms, or can people send notes to FOSA if they're trying to track you down?
Well, for me, basically, it'd be better. I'm not very good at that social platform stuff. I am on Facebook, but the best way to get me would be my email, and my email address is simply my name, Nicholas.Bellantoni@UConn.edu. So anybody has any questions in the audience, I'd be happy to entertain them. Just shoot me a quick line, and I'd be happy to answer any of them.
And then Sarah?
And for the Office of State Archaeology, we have a Facebook page, which is just Office of State Archaeology on Facebook, and we also have a web page, which is osa.uconn.edu.
Hey, last quick question. Given that it's Halloween month, is there a cemetery in our state that you guys enjoy visiting for one reason or another? Been asking that of people, just giving them ideas. There's some great cemeteries in our state, but does each one of you, do you have a favorite cemetery?
There are so many beautiful ones. I would say go to Jewett City Cemetery if you want to know about vampires and visit that. But Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford is one of the most beautiful, as is Worcester Cemetery in Danbury and Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven. Those are my favorites.
Oh, perfect. Scott?
Yeah, I was out in Danbury. We did a little project there. It was kind of fun, and it's always kind of stuck in my mind as a really cool story. There was a crypt that appeared out of the ground. Some soil eroded away. They found a crypt door. It had been lost in time. It was only, again, probably the late 19th or the 19th century, but somehow it got buried, covered up, and there was no record of it. So that was a really cool project and kind of a fun little cemetery to walk around in.
And Sarah?
I really like some of the older cemeteries in Brooklyn, Connecticut. They're really beautiful and peaceful and quiet. And not in Connecticut, but if anyone ever has a chance to visit the Albany area in upstate New York, Albany Rural Cemetery is a massive park-like cemetery that was part of the rural cemetery movement, and it's incredibly beautiful. You could get lost walking around in there for days.
Fantastic. Well, guys, I just wanted to thank you on another fantastic episode. Our time is up. If anybody has any comments or questions, they can send them to info@icrvradio.com. That's info@icrvradio.com. Nick, Scott, Sarah, you're awesome.
Happy Halloween, everybody.
Thanks. Have a good night, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks again,
Bye-bye,
Nick.
guys.
Take care.
Bye, Nick.